countless pages.
Mass migration history. Hindus and Sikhs who have been living in Pakistan moved laboriously toward the east for the safety of India, while other millions of Muslims headed in the opposite direction, hoping to reach Pakistan before the marauding bands of enemies would slay them and their families. Most of them had never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplace, and almost none knew their destination.
So that is a brief introduction, I guess, to the work that I was doing before Shattered Lands, the book that I was speaking about earlier, and that evolved into it. Firstly, I just wanted to say, how sad it is that whilst I'm on stage here, my other two co-founders, Sadia from Lahore and Sparsh from Delhi, and particularly Sparsh, aren't here right now. This project, I guess, emerged out of a strange conversation that we were all having in our final year of university. This strange realization that it was easier firstly, for Indians and Pakistanis and Bangladeshis to sit in the same room in South Asia's former colonizers' country than in the subcontinent itself. So sort of thick are the walls and that have ruptured their way through the subcontinent since. But I think far more bizarre was the way that so often when people talk about their ancestral homes from partition, they talk about it as a sort of world that's lost to them almost, as this kind of place that did exist but no longer does. And of course it does still exist, it's just on the other side of this border. And so from this conversation came this strange realization that my friend Sparsh's family home, ancestral home, a town called Bela, not far from Jhang, south of Islamabad by a couple of hours. For him it was this kind of impossibly remote, distant place, full of all sorts of emotion, but for Amina it was a 2-hour drive from Islamabad. And likewise, her family had migrated from Hoshiarpur in what's now East Punjab. But for me and Sparsh living in Delhi, that was just a 3-hour train ride and incredibly easy to visit. And despite the partition of South Asia in 1947 having constituted the largest forced migration in human history, between 10 to 15 million people were displaced in the course of 9 months of 1947. It remains unmatched by any migration ever recorded. There is still no right to return. There is still no tourist agreement between these countries. Unlike, for example, Bangladesh, where things have begun to change, right? And depending on the political dispensation there, Indians have been able to see their old homes, or Pakistanis have been able to see their own homes in Bangladesh. But by and large, except for a lucky few who have connections or manage to get an invite for such and such a reason, it is very difficult to cross the India-Pakistan border. As I mentioned in my session this morning, it is the only wall on planet Earth visible from space because it's so heavily militarized and surrounded by millions of fog lights. And so Project Astan essentially evolved from that conversation. Our aim initially was to reconnect 75 families with their pre-partition homes and communities before the 75th anniversary, which was 2022. COVID got in the way, so we did fall short of this. We managed about 40 families, I'd say. But it was a remarkable project to have worked on because we didn't have any funding, we were all students, and it was just people messaging in over Instagram saying, I can help, I can help, I can help. We eventually got a bit of funding to kind of help tidy it all up and do some animations later. But it was this whole network of friends across the border who we made in order to help reconnect families. And on several occasions, we managed to find long-lost neighbors, childhood best friends who'd got stranded on the other side of the borders. And I think in the course of this project, it was amazing how much the kind of narrative, that 75 years of nationalist myth-making on both sides of the border get washed away through putting old neighbors in touch and having a conversation about, how has the food in the dhaba changed, and that kind of thing. So we're going to be chatting, the way that we're structuring this talk is we're going to be having a little chat about oral history, a bit about the project. I'd love to hear a bit of Framji's own work as well. And then around, we'll have about 20 minutes for questions at the end, so please do get thinking. And at the end, put your hand up and questions, not comments, please. But yeah, thank you. Oh, have we got
The big question I wanted to ask you is, through going through this process with families and connecting them, what did you learn? What were your insights about partition and about the time distance, about the geographical distance, any of those things?
So I think what you mentioned about geographical distance, I think one of the first things that I began to realize through this project is that so often we treat partition as something that is fundamentally a story of Punjab or Bengal, and then sometimes we focus a bit on the kind of, Sindh's border with Rajasthan and Gujarat. But the extent to which it was a pan-subcontinental affair, the fact that there was 3 times more displacement from what is now the Indian state of Telangana, in Hyderabad state, than there was in the Palestinian Nakba the same year. And yet, the story of Hyderabad state is very rarely sort of put at the forefront of our minds when thinking about 20th century history. 3 times more displacement in Telangana than during the Palestinian Nakba, and it somehow features as a footnote to the partition story. And that gives you a sense of the scale with which we're talking. I think it's also interesting how the different narratives have coalesced in different countries, because obviously here it's a difficult but sort of almost necessary step to the birth of a nation. In India, it's the kind of dismemberment of a motherland, and in Bangladesh, it's often treated as this kind of misguided step on the road to the creation of an independent Bangladesh. But these nationalist histories that I think we all grow up listening to often conceal a far more tightly woven story of friends and joint communities, and always differences, but no more differences than exist in any society, including here in Karachi to this day. What I think an example of this was actually the very first interview that we did with this wonderful man, Iqbaluddin. His family migrated from East Punjab, from a town called Ropar, to Lahore, and eventually ended up in London. And when we'd first started broaching the subject of partition, with his family had got in touch with us. When we first started broaching the subject, he told us all of these stories about Jinnah and the Muslim League and Gandhi and Nehru and what Mountbatten was up to and divide and rule and, you know, all, and this political story that notably did not include his own story. And he told us about the kind of, you know, a genocide of Muslims in East Punjab and how you could never trust Hindus and Sikhs and all of this sort of thing. And it was only later when we began to ask him about life before partition that sort of these years of narratives suddenly dissipated, and he started telling us all about his childhood best friend, who was a Sikh named Narendra Singh. And he said that if he didn't really care about seeing the village that much, but he was desperate to see his old friend Narendra Singh again. He and Narendra had exchanged letters as late as 1960s, but until basically the 1965 war had cut off the postal access and made it much more difficult to communicate with lost friends on the other side. And I think that, so we went out, and I think that for me was an interesting way that when we tried to tackle the question dead on, we got very little results. But the moment that we asked about life beforehand, a whole world of sort of contradictory narratives sort of emerged. And we eventually went back to Ropur. We found his old mosque. Again, it was a guy in Dhaba who said, oh yes, I remember this family of Narendra Singh. His wife, he's passed away, but his wife and kids are all living in Mohalli now, which is just outside Chandigarh. So off we drove for 4 hours to Chandigarh, and there they were. And we managed to put them in touch with Iqbal for the first time in 75 years. And, you know, there was this big, very emotional moment when they were all crying over the phone to each other. Iqbal invited Narendra's family on holiday with him to London. Maybe they could go to France together. And then Kuldeep, Narendra's wife, was like, oh, not sure about that.
Well, you know, one of the really interesting things about this whole period is we read in history books and in more formal academic narratives. Huh? Oh, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Better? Okay. So what I find really interesting is that the more official narratives focus on the carnage and the death and the trains that went back and forth, and you get, but when you talk to people, individuals, and they tell you about their personal stories and about the lives they lived before they were displaced, that those lives are about connection and neighbors, and you will always hear stories about my Muslim neighbor saved my life and my Hindu neighbor saved my life. We got this warning early and we were able to hide and then get away in time. So, and that those connections, the sort of neighborly connections or community connections mattered mattered in terms of life and death, really, for many people. And we get very few of those in official narratives. And I think one of the things your project does is makes that very clear, is that the psychic rupture, of course, is huge, of leaving your home and being displaced in these particular ways, but also that the connections that people had that they had to leave behind, which is very much part of the psychic rupture. Did you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is one of the biggest changes that's occurring in partition scholarship in the last decade or two. A lot of declassified files are sort of agreeing essentially with a lot of oral testimonies that have been recorded here through the Citizens Archive of Pakistan or through the Museum of National History in Delhi, through the Partition Museum in Berkeley in the 1947 Partition Archive. What a lot of these are suggesting is that actually the stories of neighbors turning on each other are so rare as to be infinitesimally small. And far more often, 90% of the violence, with a huge 10% of course not being this, but 90% seems to have actively been active paramilitary groups trying to kind of, push religious minorities out of the region. Groups such as the RSS, the Muslim League National Guards, these had all emerged in the course of World War II, often as kind of, South Asian equivalents of the Boy Scouts or something. But when weapons had begun to spread in the wake of World War II with demobilization, there was, these self-defense groups had taken an active role in basically ethnic cleansing, but 90% of the oral histories that we certainly came across, and I know that each of CAP, Partition Museum, 1947 Archive, all say exactly the same thing, which is that we virtually never have come across a story where neighbours actually turned on each other, and far more was, oh, some people came from outside the village and we don't know who they were, and we were hidden by our Muslim neighbours in their basement. And when dawn came, our Muslim neighbours gave us a bullock cart and helped us get across the border. And it's a very sort of subtly different story that I think we could do well to remember. We could do well to remember the ties that link together this part of the world. I mentioned it at another talk, but it's not, there is no other conflict zone, essentially, which have been at war so recently as May, where still, any Indian and Pakistani meets abroad, they instantly become best friends, they all eat the same food, they're all listening to the same music, very often dating one another. And that's just not the case with Russians and Ukrainians or Israelis and Palestinians or any of the other major conflict zones in the 21st century. And so there is still this sort of underbelly of shared memory and shared culture, I think.
Yeah, one of the things you said a few days ago in a talk you gave is that the experience of South Asians in princely states was radically different from the experience of South Asians, or significantly different than the experience of South Asians in the Raj, or residents of regions that were governed directly by the Raj. Could you talk about that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah, so I think we very often brush over this distinction that was incredibly important between British India and princely India. There was, of course, around 560-something princely states that existed in the Raj, had given up their foreign policy, their defense, their communications to the British, but were internally basically independent. And I think that there often, there wasn't that attempt to have democracy with separate religious electorates, etc. So often the divisions between different religious communities was far less divisive. Often also the princely state administrations took a very strong role in either preventing or actively fostering violence within their states. And the examples are that Bhavalpur, Jaipur, and several others, Jodhpur, basically took such a strong role in stopping violence that virtually no one was killed in these regions, despite them being in the border regions next to some of the worst affected districts in the entirety of the Raj. Huge numbers of people migrated, but those were people who often wanted to migrate and chose, and the Maharajas or Nawabs actively worked across state borders between Jaipur, Jodhpur and Bhavalpur to allow people peaceful crossing if they so wished, without violence occurring. And that's very different from states such as Bharatpur and Alwar, where the princely administrations took a very active role in active ethnic cleansing. I think Faridkot in Punjab was another one where the rulers seemed to take quite an active role in basically pitching the army against their subjects. But, that was not the case in Bhavalpur, Jodhpur and Jaipur, where they worked in a brilliant way that, again, is far too often brushed over in favour of looking on at what was going on in the British-ruled districts, essentially.
So, in your travels around Pakistan and India today, would you say that same sensibility of neighborliness exists, or have the divisions become more defined, more pronounced on the person-to-person level as opposed to the government political level?
Big question. And I'm sure that you, as well as I, know that things are tense right now, but on a person-to-person level, individual relationships could not be less affected. But there is this huge tension that grows whenever things go to war. The desire for some sort of resolution, I think, is palpable in both countries still, and everyone talks longingly. In Delhi, there's almost, where I live, there's almost this kind of an almost meme about kind of nostalgic kind of poetry about Lahore ki galiyan, and this kind of thing that's almost so kind of trite because everyone is yearning for Lahore ki galiyan. And and you go to Lahore, and it's the same of imagining Delhi ki galiyan kind of thing. And it's almost a kind of, like a joke on Instagram these days of these reels. So there is this huge yearning, politics and the rise of Hindu nationalism, yet again more fighting in Kashmir, the fact that there were sort of missiles and drones flying over the border, it doesn't put things in a good suit for anything much to happen. But we've got to remember, I think, at least this is what I hold on to, is that the last time that everyone that I've spoken to who talks about the closest that we've ever come to a resolution always points at the Agra summit on both sides of the border, which I think was between, if I'm not wrong, Musharraf and Vajpayee, which was, military and the BJP. So you never know. And on anything is possible. As I said, I think on a person-to-person basis, it's just very unlike any other major conflict area, because everyone does, on a person-to-person level, just get on.
My sense is that we are how many generations away from partition? I think 5, 6 generations now distant from partition. And I think the younger generation don't have the same kind of understanding or the same kind of connection to that kind of the traumatic break that happened in 1947 as, say, older generations do. And I certainly don't in the same way that my parents' generation did or my grandparents' generation did. So is that figuring in, I mean, is this the generation that you took back to their hometowns in their family? Would you say that their families had different responses to this initiative, that they, some were against it, some were for it, or was there a kind of collective understanding that this was a healing process or a good thing? Or
No, that's a really good question. I think Anam Zakaria, one of Pakistan's greatest oral historians of partition, wrote that in her experience, it very often is the youngest generations with the most hardline views on, life across the border, because they are the ones who don't, although the elder generation lived through partition, experienced the horrors, they also experienced life before the other was really the other. And when, everyone was living alongside one another in all sorts of difficulty, as in things weren't necessarily equal in some provinces, Hindu landlords were ruling over kind of, Muslims and vice versa in other areas. So things were never sort of, this pristine, lovey-dovey, communal harmony that sometimes it's egged up to be. But there was this sense of understanding the other, which I think is disappearing. At the same time, through Project Dastan, I think we were consistently amazed at how almost always it was the younger generations who were reaching out to us, who were curious about where their family came from. I think that one of the big changes that's happened this decade, which happened a kind of decade earlier with, for example, Holocaust testimonies and World War II testimonies, is that the first generation who migrates wants to move past these traumatic memories. The second generation, often living in a new country or a new city, wants to kind of fit in and just be normal in that place and not have to think about the past. Whereas it's the third generation who is fully from this new city, is fully from Karachi or from Delhi or wherever the family's migrated, that suddenly is secure enough to ask the questions of where they're from and wants to write this all down at precisely the same time as the elder generation is disappearing, wanting to get down these family stories on paper, and at the same time that enough time has passed to allow that silence to be unwound somewhat. And so certainly the vast majority of the families we spoke to were often speaking for the first time, but it was around these big centennials, or the 70th anniversary, the 75th anniversary. I'm sure we'll have it again at the 80th anniversary, although with fewer and fewer people still able to share memories. Of course, once we get to the 80th and 85th anniversaries, people are too old and dementia or whatever, or too young at the time to really have any solid memories. But definitely there is this yearning to understand where one's individual family came from, even if it doesn't necessarily filter up into a kind of macro state-level narrative.
Right. Well, I mean, I think in South Asia we have a very different allegiance to the land in a way that perhaps I don't want to say the West in some kind of monolithic way, but my sense is that we have a different relationship to the land and the places where we come from, as opposed to, say, friends of mine in the U.S. whose families have moved across the country and have done so regularly. I mean, have not necessarily identified a particular place that they called home or an origin for a family.
I'd love you to speak a bit about, so Framji's done amazing work in oral history in Hunza, in getting kids to negotiate and kind of interact with Hunza history and the various changes that have affected Hunza society.
We're supposed to talk about your project, don't we?
No, let's hear a bit about it.
So what I've been doing is I did this twice, and I want to go back and do it again, was to teach... Can you hear me now? Yeah. So what I did was I wanted to teach students how to tell stories in performance, or how to do oral performance storytelling, and to do it in a way that actually reclaimed things, histories for them that they didn't know or that they weren't necessarily aware of. So the first time I did it, I did it at Zabist when I was teaching there with the second year students. And then after that, I did it with my cousin's class 5 students at Learning Tree, and that was also fun. That was 2 weeks of a project on how to tell a story that they wanted to tell about who they were and what they were pissed off about living in Karachi. And this project, when I used to do it in the US, developed around human rights issues. So students would take the challenge was to take a human rights issue and turn it into a human narrative, or tell a human story out of an issue, right? So it was about not necessarily focusing on the sort of ideological angles of an issue that one might read in an academic essay, but rather to see how that issue specifically impacted an individual, a family, a set of relationships, a community. So that's what we did in Hunza. That's what I did in Hunza. There were 28 students from 3 different schools. It was the fall right before COVID. So I was going to go back and do it again, and COVID hit and I couldn't do that. And then I got COVID and I was stuck with COVID and long COVID for a while, so I haven't been able to go back. But I'm hoping to do it not this year, but next year. And to work, they want me to work with 5 schools, and I have no idea how I'm going to do that. But it's really a process of students going out into the community, interviewing their elders. So they had to interview an elder in their own families. They had to interview a stranger who they'd never met. They had to interview a business person in their community, and they had to bring all these stories back to as a group, and then they spoke about the stories, and we talked about them, and we figured out ways to stage certain things in relation to the stories. And then after 2.5 months, we presented this to the community in Aliabad and Karimabad, and the students were happy, the parents were happy. I was happy. I got to spend 3 months in Hunza. Yeah. But really, I think it's important that the younger generation actually do the work, not just to actually have stories told to them, but to recover the stories, because it becomes embodied in a certain way. That doesn't happen if you're just reading it in a textbook, or you're just hearing it from a grandfather or a great uncle or some such thing.
I think it's such an important thing to get to grips with, is that, you know, even the stories that these kids went out and collected will probably be of immense scholarly value to the right scholars who are trying to kind of understand the social change that emerged in Hunza around, you know, during the 20th century. The idea, which I think many people, I think, dismiss oral history as, you know, oh, but how can you really trust people's memories, particularly after so many years? But the moment that you begin to treat it as a source like any other historical source, that needs to be wrestled with and grappled with and, judged for bias and looked at through all sorts of different lenses, just like you would treat a memoir or like you would treat a government document. And okay, this is a state narrative I'm hearing, or this is a narrative meant, that someone's trying to justify their actions from 75 years ago. Every historical source is ultimately someone's perspective and their own attempt to grapple with their own memory and other people's memory. And I think that there is this growing awareness of that we need to start collecting memory from, these turbulent changes that have occurred during the 20th and early 21st century. I think Citizens Archive of Pakistan is, doing immensely great work on precisely this, in trying to bring together, and all the other archives I've mentioned, in trying to bring together just different people's memories. It's amazing how much more color and texture that and visceral understanding you can gain about the past through oral testimony in a way that you can never get by looking at government archives about kind of numbers and statistics. That doesn't mean, you treat it uncritically and that you don't sort of, look for ways people could be trying to persuade you of something else. But it's, the fact that when you first told me this story about these kids, I couldn't help but think there is going to be some PhD scholar somewhere in the world who would die to get their hands on these recordings, because it would probably tell the history of modern Hunza actually in a far more kaleidoscopic way than 90% of the books that have ever been written on the region.
Yeah, well, I have a video recording of the whole event.
Yeah.
Serendipitously, because one of your fellow countrymen was camping in a tent outside my hotel room and decided that he would just take a video of the entire event and a couple of rehearsals. So I have it. If you would like it for your archive, I'd happily give it to you. But one of the things I wanted to follow up on what you just said. So when I began this process with the students, and I tend to do it more with students now, is I showed them a TED Talk. So Chimamanda Adichie's TED Talk, it's called The Danger of a Single Story. And I think maybe some of you have actually seen it. It's a really, it's a very simple talk, but it's a very profound talk. In that, what it argues is that a singular story, or a single way, or an ideologically singular way of looking at an issue is never going to capture the complexity of people's lives. And that, in fact, you need multiple stories about even single issues, in order to approach or understand the complexity of the issue for the people involved or who have lived through it. And I think perhaps that's part of the beauty of this project of yours, is that it brings together multiple testimonies and multiple stories of that period, and of people who actually lived it, not just people who went to the archives and heard about it and wrote about it.
I think the way in which oral testimonies can completely flip your expectations on their head. There's one of the most important stories early on in my book, is the story of this Dalit man from Tamil Nadu who migrates to Burma to escape caste. Later, through what I call the first partition of Burma in 1937, his family is forced to walk on foot back from Burma to Tamil Nadu in India's deep south. And so, I was looking through all of these recordings of his testimonies, and there was a particular line that stuck out to me, which was, he was asked what he did on Indian Independence Day. He said, I didn't realize independence came. I kept working like everyone else in the area. And in fact, our whole area of Madras, found out that we'd got independence about 3 weeks later. The way that these narratives are told from a status perspective, you would never hear that story. Likewise, one of my best friends, Sparsh, his family migrated from a town called Bela near Jhang and moved to Delhi. When we spoke to his grandfather, he said till the day that a mob came in from another village and were just killing all the Hindus there, and he was saved by his Muslim neighbors who sheltered him in his house, what we were just talking about. Until that day, They'd never heard that there was a discussion about whether to have Hindustan or Pakistan, he said. But from that day, he found out that there was all these discussions. And again, the ways in which, for him, there was a hugely different kind of series of events that were affecting their daily life, and not the big stories that now are treated as the kind of, these stories that affected everyone. And I think again and again, time and again, you hear these stories of individual lives that challenge our understandings of what necessarily happened on a certain day, or who heard it when,
But also partition, independence didn't happen for everybody across South Asia at the same time. So we talk about 1947 as if it's the momentous break from England. But Goa was still a Portuguese territory until the 1960s.
Gwadar was part of Oman until the 1950s.
Right. So, so in a sense, partition, when we talk about partition, I think we think of it as a historical event, but it really is an ongoing event. And I think this what the video shows is that for people who really lived through it, it is still very much a lived experience. It is not something that happened in the past. It informs everything they do and who they are as people.
I think it affects every aspect of politics as well. I mean, in order to understand the kind of, situation that minorities across South Asia are in, to understand the nuclearization of the India-Pakistan conflict, to understand, India's recent obsession with creating a national register of citizens. That demand first emerges in the wake of 1971, to do with, Pakistani refugees that were coming in during the 71, before India got involved, but after Operation Searchlight. Every aspect of society in all of these countries is tied to these events, and yet people often prefer to leave that event in the past rather than to unpick it. And yet it is, it remains the central moment in modern history.
But also the way citizenship questions are formulated both in India and in Pakistan. With the Bengali refugees currently and with the Afghan refugees here, the way in which we frame these things are directly linked to, I think, that partition moment, that moment of partition.
I mean, yes, and multiple. For those who were in my session earlier, we were chatting about. I think it's the Chakma Raja from what's now Bangladesh, who describes that a man's citizenship and his place of birth can change country all number of times without his being consulted, and he'd changed 3 times. I met one person who changed nationality 5 times, and there are and so often which country someone belonged to was not their choice. I mentioned earlier this man Ghulam Ali, who was a Lucknowi in the Indian army, stationed in Lahore, but he wanted to remain Indian. He didn't want to become Pakistani, so he tries to migrate to Lucknow. But in Lucknow, they said, "Oh, you were in Lahore at partition, so you must be a Pakistani." They deported him to Pakistan, where they said, "Oh, but we've got your papers here. You said you decided to stay in Lucknow," and he was deported no less than kind of 8 times between the 2 countries, with neither country claiming him. And then we don't know what happens to him. His papers just disappear from the file and end one day in the early 1950s. We don't know which country he ended up in, whether he survived, whether he passed away in prison. We don't know. And I think that this is a common situation for so many minority groups across the region who had no part to play in the country that they ended up being governed by.
Right. Well, for Parsis have a very weird relationship to partition because we have reverse partition. There's so many Parsis who actually moved back to India, and there are Parsis from India who ended up moving to Pakistan. And recently, it's not something that happened 50 years ago. These things happened within the last decade or so. And those are bizarre experiences for people as well. I mean, and they mostly happen because of marriage. But somebody who's grown up in India who then gets married to somebody in Pakistan and ends up moving here, for minorities, it's actually somewhat easier than for, say, cross-religious marriages in terms of Hindus marrying Muslims or Muslims marrying Hindus, where citizenship then becomes a real issue. for whoever is in the wrong country, in a sense, right? Whatever that wrong country means. But I wanted to mention one other thing. So a friend of mine who teaches at LUMS, until very recently, for her entire life, had both an Indian and a Pakistani passport. And she considered herself both an Indian and a Pakistani citizen until they took away her Indian passport at the airport in Mumbai because they discovered that she had both, and that's not allowed. Even though dual citizenship is allowed, that's not allowed.
India, it's not allowed. So
but you know, and it's the only person I've ever heard of who had both an Indian and a Pakistani passport, and has had it for almost 50 years without incident, and then recently had to give it up.
There was a very interesting conversation that I was having not too recently that argued that so many of the great conflicts in South Asia could possibly be resolved if India and Pakistan both had dual citizenship. It's allowed here, but it's not allowed in India. And the Agra summit, which we mentioned earlier, which is widely regarded as one of the closest that the governments came to signing a full-on kind of peace treaty and resolution to fighting over Kashmir, etc. The resolution was essentially that the line of control would basically become an international border, and all Kashmiris would get dual citizenship. And that kind of the entire area would be demilitarized, etc. And this idea that you can belong to multiple places, I think that so often the issue is in trying to box the multiplicity of our identities. The fact that we can belong to more than one place. We're not trees. We don't have roots that have to be in one specific place. We all move. We all have multiple facets to our identity that make us who I am. We are kind of, there's ethnicity, religion, culture, the city we grew up in, the city we moved to for college, the type of people within that city who we hang out with, the TV shows that we watch, the books we read, that all play as much of a role as the kind of, and today, I think in the 21st century, the nation, although who knows for how much longer. We seem to be moving into a scary new age of empire with events in the States recently. But basically since the end of World War II, the nation has been the basic unit of measurement of global politics, brushing over the fact that virtually everyone does have ties to multiple places, and that citizenship and identity and belonging is complicated.
Yes. I think we should open it up for questions. We have about 10 minutes.
Do we have a microphone in the...
Ilsa
yes,
over
okay.
there.
There's a lady over here.
Hi. So this is kind of a carry forward question from your last talk also, but it's relevant to this one too. So, we talked about how we've been used to rewriting a teleological version of South Asian subcontinental history. And it looks like your work is neither teleological nor revisionist, right? And so how would you define your historiographical lens? How does it lend to your research methods? And more importantly, how does it lend itself to a reasonable construction of narrative history?
Sure, wonderful question. I'm going to try and answer it as best as I can. I think one of the key ways that I try to push against this teleological kind of sense of inevitability in history, if you're reading a book on the rise of Pakistan, it's going to treat Pakistan as the inevitable conclusion but what I try to show very much is how many other ways it could have gone. But more importantly, I made a very active point to try and look with each of the partitions that I talk about, at what point does it become inevitable? Because for each of these things, there's these kind of closing doors moments before which anything was possible, but after which suddenly everything's been sent onto a specific train track and there's no way of diverting off course. So with 1947, I think it was Direct Action Day, the first major riots in Kolkata, before which anything could have happened. Jinnah accepted the cabinet mission plan, which was this plan that would have made Pakistan a bit like Scotland, part of a greater South Asian federation, and Jinnah accepts and Nehru and Gandhi don't. there are all sorts of ways that things could have gone. 10 years, I think the reason that I started the book where I do in the 1920s is that none of these partitions in the 1920s are inevitable, and that although they are on the table as options, it's not like kind of no one had ever heard of two-nation theory, as everyone knows there are people talking about it for years, but I think that it far more spoken about, and again, we talk about, oh yes, and so Syed Ahmed in Aligarh University mentions the idea briefly in the 1910s, and it's like, sure, but reading the newspapers in the 1920s, there's far more discussion on a breakaway Dravidian South Indian state than there is on a religious state. And so, yes, these options existed, but they existed alongside an array of alternative possibilities. And I try to focus in on that. What were the alternatives, and when did they disappear, and how do we end up with the quite specific kind of moment? What is the moment of inevitability? With 1971, I think it's the launching of Operation Searchlight. Before that, there were all sorts of different things that could be negotiated. After that, very few people from the Bangladeshi side are willing to discuss anything else. With Burma, it's the Wall Street crash. There are so many different ways that history could have gone. Yeah, but thank you. I hope that answers the question somewhat. There's someone who's got the microphone. Have we got? Here we go. Yes, there's someone. There's someone in the front and someone in the back. Yes. Hello. Oh. Hello. What is? Yes. Yeah. We heard you just then. Oh.
Very interesting talk. I know you said no comments, but I have a comment to make. I am an Indian, married to a Pakistani, and my son was born in Bangladesh because we stayed there. So I identify with all the three.
Yeah.
So yeah, I thought I should contribute my two bit. I have had conversations with Indians, Pakistanis, and Bangladeshis who are touchy about the subject of partition and.
Where in India is your family from?
Sorry.
Where in India is your family from?
We are from Dalrymple.
Okay, lovely.
I'm married in Karachi.
Yeah.
We were for like 2 years, and then we moved to Bangladesh, and we were there for 10 years.
Amazing.
So they can speak Bangla, and they can speak Urdu, and they can speak Hindi. So it's like that.
Amazing. No, it's incredible how much, how common in a sense, I think, people with more complex lives than these narratives allow kind of exist. And yeah, thank you for sharing that. That was wonderful. We've got 5 minutes left, so.
Like her experience, I've lived.
And then there's next one in the back, please. Yes, hello.
From Midnight Student to your book, I haven't read your book, so I don't know. This particular migration has not been, I wonder if you have not been touched upon between India and Pakistan as the prosperous Hindu minority of Sindh. Because I lived as expats in Singapore and other places, which is where they migrated to. And they have created a very Western lifestyle because there was no Sindhi language migration within India from Pakistan. But they had to vacate, and we got very good homes in these Sakhar, Karachi and Hyderabad, left by them. Nobody researches on that, and your oral narrative topic here, you would be absolutely amazed. I am a migrant, first generation Sindhi from UP, peacefully migrated. They were least passionate Pakistanis, my mother-in-law side. My other Punjabis badly migrated, killed, maimed, raped, passionate Pakistanis. Came with conscious land love. So these dynamics, when you write about the migration and oral history, please research about
I do, and it's quite there extensively, and I'd recommend that you read the book. And I would also add, I mean, one of the great tragedies is the partition of the publishing industry, because there is an enormous literature of Sindhi Hindu migration stories in Bombay and Ahmedabad in Gujarat and Maharashtra that is extensive. And I was on stage in Jaipur just last week with 2 Sindhi Hindu authors who'd written up their stuff, but sadly their books are not published internationally. They're published in India and can't be published here. And so often they would speak similarly about the fact that, no one back in Sindh is ever writing about the old Sindhi Hindu population. And of course, people on all sides are talking about it, but they're unable to communicate with one another across this divide.
Visits. These are my friends.
But, yes.
All of them, Malkanis,
Ne-
Palranis, they
Huh.
had never been to. They had no connection at all.
Huh. No.
They just remembered.
It's-
they didn't want to visit.
There's a sense, I think, in the Sindhi Hindu community, particularly in Bombay, that the sort of language that you hear is that they are migrants without a homeland. There is no Sindhi majority speaking area of India, and so every Sindhi migrant who left Sindh, the entire world of Sindhi Hinduism that vanished, they had to settle in and acclimatize somewhere else and learn new languages. And so within India, Sindhi is increasingly dying out, and a lot of Sindhi writers are incredibly worried about this, and there's all sorts of programs to try and get young Sindhi Hindus and Udasis and various other religious communities. Yeah, we need to take... Oh, we're at time.
One quick thing, which has nothing to do with this panel, but yesterday when they announced the fiction prize, they didn't actually announce the shortlist, and I just wanted to say that all 3 novels on the shortlist were fantastic, and it was an incredibly difficult decision. And the other 2 novels were by Aisha Hassan, it's called When the Fireflies Dance, and Ruhi Chaudhary, which is called Outside Women. And they're both fantastic, in addition to Shandana Minhas's Firdaus Nama, which is not published here because it's published in India, and we have no copies because they refuse to send any, which is,
Aisha's book is particularly good. I've read that one.
So I just wanted to plug those 2. Thank you very much. Thank you so much.
Okay. I think I'm going to be going out after this to the Liberty book stand to do another little signing, and then I've got to rush off to the media team. But outside.